I'm Steve Liebman. The two stories you're about to see happened almost 40 years apart. But while separated by a generation, they're remarkably similar. In December 2003 on Queensland's Sunshine Coast, 13-year-old Daniel Morecambe disappears while on his way to buy Christmas presents for the rest of his family. Crime Investigation Australia will retrace Daniel's last movements and feature moving interviews with members of his family. But first, we turn the clock back to Sydney 1960 and a crime that's committed that is so brutal it leaves an entire nation stunned by its cruelty. The Sydney Opera House, probably the world's most recognisable 20th century building. And incredibly, this modern marvel and pride of a nation is linked to one of the most infamous crimes in Australia's history. When construction began on this Australian icon in the late 1950s, it was partially funded by a huge lottery, the Opera House Lottery. First prize, £100,000. That's around $5 million in today's currency. But for one man and his family, the dream of winning the Opera House Lottery turned into a nightmare. It sparked a crime so shocking that it stunned and saddened an entire nation. And it sparked a police investigation of extraordinary sophistication for its time. It was a case that would mark the origin of modern forensic science in Australia. The year is 1960. Sydney is a young city with a population of almost 2 million. There are a few skyscrapers and the Sydney Harbour Bridge dominates the skyline. Trams trundle the streets and Bondi is Australia's most famous beach. Basil Thorne is a 37-year-old commercial traveller living here at Bondi with his wife Frida and their two children, Graeme 8 and Belinda 3. He spends £3, almost a quarter of the average weekly wage, to chase everyone's dream. Like thousands of others, he queues to buy a ticket in Opera House Lottery number 10. Lo and behold, Basil Thorne's impossible dream comes true. He wins the lottery, £100,000, and like previous winners, he's front page news. The Thornes' 8-year-old son Graeme Thorne is a student at one of Sydney's most respected private schools, Scots College in Bellevue Hill, not far from Bondi. Thursday, July 7th, 1960, is shaping up as a sunny winter's day. Frida Thorne sends Graeme off to school, and it's the same routine each morning. Graeme leaves his home here in Edward Street at 8:30, turns into Wellington Street, and heads down to the corner of O'Brien Street. And there he waits for a family friend, Mrs. Phyllis Smith, who normally drives Graeme to school along with her two sons. On this particular morning, a schoolmate spots Graeme walking towards his normal corner. A few minutes later, Phyllis Smith arrives at the corner, but there's no sign of the boy. She sends one of her sons to look for him, and then goes straight to the Thornes' flat. Frida, sensing something might be terribly wrong, contacts Bondi Police.
Yes, he's missing. Can you come down quickly, please?
Sergeant Larry O'Shea is the first on the scene.
Walked into the place and Mrs. Thorne was there and the phone rang. She answered and then she handed it to me. I took the receiver and spoke into the phone and this bloke said, "I've got your son and he's on £25,000 and if I don't get it by 5 o'clock I'll feed him to the sharks." I was shocked, all right. I couldn't believe that it happened.
The threatening caller, speaking in a European accent, says he'll phone again later in the day. A shaken Sergeant O'Shea calls Bondi Police Station for reinforcements. Lloyd Noonan is a detective based there.
You've got to get up here right away. A boy's gone missing.
Well, we were at the station when, the police station at Bondi, when Sergeant O'Shea contacted us to tell us that they think that they've got this serious crime and we should get up to the house as soon as possible.
Detective Sergeant Ken Beret is the boss of Bondi Detectives.
Cars queued up outside the place, which we really, in case of a kidnapping, wanted to be kept quiet. So I told them what they should do, move off quickly or get locked up.
Despite police efforts to keep the story quiet, Daily Mirror reporter Bill Perry acts on a tip-off.
I was in the office a bit after 9 o'clock, and Dave Dixon, who was one of our police rounds guys with good connections, he got a tip-off that the boy was missing, and I was dispatched to go to Wellington Street, Bondi, to make inquiries to see what was happening. At that stage, there was never any question of a kidnap. It was unheard of, a kidnap in Australia. Even the hardest criminals wouldn't have done anything to a child. So I just went out there thinking that I'm going to interview somebody about somebody who's missing, a lost kid. So I knocked on the door, and a big burly police sergeant answered, and he said, "What do you want?" And I said, "I had to identify myself from the Daily Mirror, and could I speak to Mr. and Mrs. Thorne?" And he said to me, "Look, if you've got any compassion, you'll go away or you'll leave." And I could hear some sounds of distress in the background, sobbing and moaning.
Well, initially, we didn't want the media involved. We wanted to have time for the kidnapper to come forward and present his demands without anybody knowing about it, so that we could take the necessary action.
The story is broken by legendary crime reporter Bill Jenkins in the afternoon paper. Freda Thorne, driving around Bondi with detectives searching for her son, sees the Daily Mirror poster. She is devastated.
The only thing I remember, she came back to the flat where they were living, and she was most upset. And we had to settle her down because of that headline in the media.
Basil Thorne is in northern New South Wales on business when Graeme goes missing. On his return to Sydney Airport, he's told that his son has been kidnapped. That evening, less than 12 hours after Graeme's disappearance, Basil goes to Bondi Police Station, and under the glare of television lights, he makes this impassioned appeal.
You right?
I'll be right, I think.
Is there any appeal you'd like to make to...
Well, all I can say is that the person that's got him, if he's a father and got children of his own, well, for God's sake, send him back in one piece. I can't.
All right, gentlemen, if I'll do the last, thanks. Sorry.
When 8-year-old Graeme Thorne is kidnapped on his way to school and a demand for a £25,000 ransom is made, a massive police operation swings into action. Detective Sergeant Ernie Freeman is in charge. He's a tough, no-nonsense cop with years of serious crime investigation behind him. Freeman and his men are deeply concerned for Graeme's safety. Many of them are fathers themselves, and even the most hard-bitten of policemen are upset and emotional, finding it hard to believe that such a thing could happen in their city.
Unbelievable. Nobody couldn't comprehend it, that somebody would kidnap somebody for ransom. We'd all, of course, heard of the Lindbergh case in America, where the man who flew the Atlantic for the first time, they took his son, and he also was killed too. But no, it's unheard of. The crime was unheard of. Nobody in their wildest imagination would have thought somebody would do it.
When the news spreads throughout Australia that a young boy has been kidnapped, the public is anxious and incensed. Olympic swimming legend Dawn Fraser recalls the public mood.
Yes, the whole team was preparing for the Olympics, for the Rome Olympics in 1960, and then to see these headlines, to see terrible, terrible headlines was One couldn't believe it was happening here in this country, because here was a beautiful big team preparing to compete in one of the biggest sporting events in the world, and yet we have this stigma of an 8-year-old boy being kidnapped because his mother and father had won an Opera House lottery.
A general alarm is issued. Police begin monitoring major roads, air and seaports. They search every conceivable hiding place and even enlist the help of some of Sydney's most notorious criminals, as Detective Pat Manning explains.
Oh, no argument. We had all the heavy crims, and like I mentioned, the ones that are dead, if you like, the McPhersons and the Freemans and all of those colourful characters that occupied the country. They let all their boys loose. They let everyone through the cross and everywhere find out who did this. We must find out. They were as keen to catch the perpetrator, and they would have given him to us. I don't think they were going to do anything stupid, but they were keen on the perpetrator being apprehended and brought to justice as we were.
The New South Wales government reacts to public anger and considers making kidnapping a capital offence.
We propose amending the Crimes Act to deal with a situation of this kind. It's something without precedent, and of course the law as it stands provides a maximum penalty of 10 years. I think, and I'm sure everybody in this state of ours thinks, that that's altogether too small.
The government posts a reward of £5,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Graeme Thorne's kidnapper. Newspaper publishers offer another £15,000. Rupert Murdoch has just recently bought the Daily Mirror from newspaper baron Ezra Norton. And by the next morning, the story of Graeme Thorne's kidnapping is dominating the news. Thousands of calls are pouring into police. Detective Sergeant Larry Foley, a 26-year veteran, is assigned the task of setting up a nerve centre at Bondi Police Station, collating the running sheets.
Every time you did an inquiry, you had to record it. That piece of paper went into a running sheet. And Larry would index it, but then there would be inquiries flowing from that. And Larry's job was to coordinate the recording of every part of that inquiry if it overlapped another inquiry.
A massive canvass of the surrounding streets turns up no sign of the boy. Information is coming from everywhere, but much of it is vague and misleading. At this early stage of the investigation, some small clues have been uncovered. A stocky man of olive complexion was spotted sitting in this park, directly across the road from the Thornes' home on several days leading up to the kidnapping. It's a similar description to the one that Frida Thorne has given police of a stranger who knocked on her door 3 weeks before her son's abduction.
Mrs. Thorne answered the front door on this particular day, and there was a man there of European appearance who said he was a private inquiry agent and was looking for a Mr. Bogner. And of course Mrs. Thorne said, "I don't know of any Mr. Bogner." There was never any person by the name of Bogner located throughout the investigation.
Thank you very much.
Another investigator, Detective Sergeant Brian Doyle, unearths a key witness. Cecil Denmead, a resident of Bondi, tells Doyle that he'd seen an iridescent blue 1955 Ford Custom Line parked less than 100 metres from the Thornes' home on the morning of the kidnapping.
There was a iridescent Ford car parked on an intersection which I had to veer around that particular vehicle to get past. Why would someone park there? Why not park down another 20 metres towards Southhead Road and make it easy for people or cars to get around? And that's more or less stood out in my mind at that particular stage. And his appearance, I mean, you know, it's a face that once you see, you never forget.
Cecil Denmead identifies the iridescent blue Ford as a 1955 Custom Line. Doyle is sceptical that the young man can have such detailed knowledge of the car makes and models. So he puts Denmead's car recognition skills through a thorough test.
They took me all around the back streets of Bondi, would pick me up of an evening in the dark, and take me around to show me cars, and to try and get one that I saw that particular night. So they were trying to make sure that I knew what I was talking about as far as the car was concerned.
Now convinced that Denmead has made a positive identification of the car, Detective Sergeant Doyle dispatches 25 police to the Department of Motor Transport's Sydney headquarters.
And I think it took us 3 or 4 days, and we had to go through every card and check and write down the particulars of everyone we found to be a Ford Custom Line dark blue. Fortunately, that guy that did identify the car, he knew his car, and that saved us a heck of a lot of time.
Police check more than 270,000 cards and find that there are 5,000 1955 Ford Custom Lines scattered throughout the state. Every one of those 5,000 Fords is cited, and where possible, the owners are interviewed. Another breakthrough comes the day after the kidnapping, with an important discovery in bush on the other side of Sydney Harbour, about 20 kilometres north of Bondi. It's Graeme Thorne's school case.
That was the first evidence, of course, of any of his possessions. Nothing had been found from the time he disappeared. To my knowledge, there was no trace of him whatsoever. And that suitcase with his little apple in, the apple was peeled right round the hole with that in the one piece. And so his mother lovingly done that, and then wrapped it back around the apple so it wouldn't go hard or brown. Always remember that's the most poignant thing to me.
By dawn the next morning, several hundred police are combing the untamed bushland. Navy helicopters, Army commandos and police skin divers join the search, along with sniffer dogs flown in from South Australia. Even local children are drafted into the search.
Every policeman that was available, whether he was on leave or whatever, was called in, and every inch of probably a square mile of where the school case had been found, and I think it had an apple or something in it. But that search revealed nothing, but it went on for a couple of days, inch by inch, yard by yard, trying to find something.
Graeme's personal effects are minutely examined, but they reveal no real leads. There are numerous alleged sightings of Graeme in theatres, cars, shops and streets all over Australia. Every report is checked, and everyone is eventually discounted. It's a logistical nightmare for the police. The sheer volume of material is overwhelming, and within weeks, Detective Sergeant Larry Foley has compiled the biggest police file ever produced in Australia. No lead is left uninvestigated, no matter how far-fetched it might seem.
We had psychics and other people who could say that they knew where the body was and things like that, like the people just saying they saw something in a dream, or they could tell from vibrations. There are all sorts of, some were, I think the police may have even listened to some of the psychics, but most of them were either rat bags or people trying to get a quid out of it.
Along with the well-meaning, the mad and the mischievous, there are the heartless opportunists who simply want to get their hands on the ransom money. Detective Jack Whelan has been working on the case from the beginning.
These things were bobbing up, I don't know how many. There must have been 10 or a dozen of these people ringing up saying, yes, we've got him, and we don't want the 25,000, we'll settle for 5,000, in unmarked bills in brown paper bags dropped in the first waste paper basket outside the town hall and all that sort of stuff.
People said they had the little boy Graeme and demanded the ransom. And Basil had asked to speak to Graeme on the phone, and of course the people said no, we can't speak on the phone, but we can answer any questions. So there'd be questions asked by Basil. What is your little schoolmate's name, Giddy? What's his proper name? And what was a previous housekeeper's name? And the like sort of questions, which of course these people couldn't answer.
Detective Constable Lloyd Noonan is assigned to live with the Thornes in case the kidnapper calls again, and to help them deal with the avalanche of letters and phone calls. Everybody wants to help bring Graeme safely home to his parents, including the Sydney Lord Mayor Harry Jensen and the Thorne family's local minister, the Reverend Clive Goodwin. They offer themselves as intermediaries. The Daily Mirror publishes a desperate handwritten appeal from Basil and Frida Thorne, asking the kidnapper to contact Reverend Goodwin, and the ransom will be paid, no questions asked. Each call that comes in gives Basil and Frida Thorne new hope that their son might be brought back to them. But the original caller, the man with the European accent who threatened to feed Graeme to the sharks, never calls back. August 16th, almost 7 weeks after Graeme's disappearance, and several children playing on a vacant lot here at Seaforth, a northern Sydney suburb, discover a small bundle wrapped in a picnic blanket under a ledge. It's Graeme Thorne's body. On August 16th, 1960, Australia's prayers and hopes turned to tears with the discovery of the body of 8-year-old kidnap victim Graeme Thorne in a vacant lot in the northern Sydney suburb of Seaforth. The overgrown lot is a playground for 4-year-old Peter McHugh and his friends.
We were all playing on the rocks together, and one of us saw this blanket that was wrapped up, tightly bound blanket that was wrapped up at the base of one of the rocks while we were playing. And we all speculated as to what it might be, and the obvious result of that speculation was that it could be a body in there. I remember us calling out to Eric Coughlin's mum, who lived next door to that rock, or those rocks, that we'd found something. And I can distinctly remember her leaning out the window telling us that we shouldn't touch it and don't go near it and have nothing to do with it and wait until our fathers got home from work. When those fathers, well, most of the fathers came home from work, they got together and walked across and made an inspection then. And the result of that was that they found the body of Graeme Thorne.
Detective John Snowden of the Police Scientific Bureau joins the investigation.
I received a call that particular night that the body was found, and I would be taken into the CIB where I met up with my partner, Ted White. He was the senior man of the pair. We then went out to Grandview Grove, Seaforth, where we were shown where the body had been found. Where the boy was lying was under a rock, an overhanging rock ledge, which would only be possibly 15 or 20 metres west of the boundary of a residence. It was in a scrub area covered with low-lying scrub. Not an ideal place for people to walk, say, with their dog, or for even children to play. The scrub was fairly tightly packed and of a low-lying variety. In that area, I photographed the body before we touched it. It was wrapped in a rug, and at that stage, you wouldn't know it contained a body. Having photographed it, we then removed part of the covering of the rug, saw that it was a body of a boy, and I took various photographs there before we moved him. I photographed the boy's feet, where his legs were tied with cord, and general photographs of the area. It was then my duty to accompany the body with the contractor who would take it to the city morgue, where an autopsy would be carried out the next morning.
The autopsy on Graeme's body reveals that he has suffered a fractured skull. He's died from being battered or strangled, or a combination of both. Detective Sergeant Ken Borre is given the task of telling Basil and Frida Thorne that their son's body has been found, but already Frida knows the worst.
She saw it on TV just before I arrived with the minister to tell her officially that the boy was dead and his body had been found.
The gruesome and tragic discovery is distressing even to the most hardened investigators.
I'm still emotional about it. I got to know the Thornes very well. I know how hard the police worked on it. We didn't get paid overtime. I didn't have a phone on here. I didn't have a meal at home, as I mentioned, but I couldn't ring my wife up and say, I'm not coming home tonight for 7 weeks. It did become so involved. I was so involved in it, and I am emotional.
Now, at that time, I had a son myself, a little bit older than Graeme, but certainly you have the same feelings as any member of the public of disgust, dismay, and all the other feelings to think that here is a young life with any degree of potential imaginable before him, and he's been killed, lost his life, lost to his family forever. A distressing thing, but we just had to cope with it.
Australians from all walks of life react with shock and revulsion when they learn the horrific details of Graeme Thorne's death. One of Australia's most enduring music stars, Col Joy, remembers feeling disbelief on hearing the news.
Oh, there was disbelief, all right, because we thought he'd come back. We thought, yes, somebody wants some money from these people that have won this big sum of money. Then when he didn't come back and we found that he's not coming back, there was anger. There was a lot of anger. I wouldn't have been surprised if a vigilante group had got out and done what would have been done.
Police are now more determined than ever to find the murderer and bring him to justice. Officers from the Scientific Division carefully examine the Onkaparinga brand rug that covers Graeme's body. They're convinced that it will yield important evidence.
When it was brought to the scientific section, it was placed on what we called our examination table. Whilst in that position, we would go around it, particularly at that stage, myself, Alan Clark, who was in charge of the scientific section, looking for whatever was on it, retrieving with tweezers, hairs, fibres, seeds, debris of any sort. Now, the hairs and fibres went to Dr. Cameron Oliver Cramp, who was the government microbiologist. Dr. Cramp decided that the hairs that he was examining under his microscope came from a Pekingese dog and from no other breed. Now, this didn't particularly please some of the investigating detectives because it limited their field of suspects. Because if they located a suspect who had a Pomeranian or a Sydney Silkie or some other similar type of dog, it was very restrictive of their investigation. But Dr. Cramp was adamant it was a Pekingese.
A professor of plant pathology, Neville White, examines traces of soil and vegetable matter found on Graeme's clothing. Dr. Joyce Vickery, a noted botanist from the Royal Botanic Gardens, is asked to examine samples of foliage collected from the blanket covering Graeme's body.
We found that there were two plants which proved to be of significance that we knew as garden plants, but were not bush plants, were not present at the site where Graeme Thorne's body was found, and therefore must have been become attached to the rug and clothing somewhere else.
Dr. Vickery's team includes Barbara Briggs, a young botanist in her first year at the Botanical Gardens.
I think I worked on it for a couple of days probably. I think I was fairly very early on realised what it was likely to be, but then I had to compare it very carefully and critically with specimens of the species that I believed it to be from our collection, and also then to check out whether there were any other species that were likely to have the same characteristics.
Horace Whitworth, curator of the Geological Museum, examines the soil samples. On August 19th, 3 days after Graeme's body is discovered, residents here in Clontarf tell police about a neighbour who owned an iridescent blue Ford Custom Line. They also inform them that the man moved house on the day of the kidnapping, and they haven't seen him since. His name, Stephen Leslie Bradley. The neighbours also tell police that Bradley's wife Magda and their 3 children left home that very morning in a taxi, and Bradley didn't come outside to farewell them. Soon afterwards, Detective Sergeant Brian Doyle visits Stephen Bradley at his place of work, the poker machine manufacturer's Nut and Muddle. Doyle discovers that Bradley was a Hungarian immigrant, born István Baranye in Budapest. He migrated to Australia in 1950, where he changed his name, and later married his second wife, Magda. He tells Detective Sergeant Doyle that he sold his house in Clontarf and was moving to a flat in Manly on July the 7th, the day Graeme Thorne was kidnapped. He admits to having owned an iridescent blue Ford Custom Line, which he has since sold to a car dealer. But he insists that the Custom Line was never out of the garage that day. He'd waited for a removalist's van to take away his furniture and then had spent the rest of the day home alone. At this point, Bradley is nothing more than another person of interest. While police work around the clock to find the murderer, Graeme Thorne's funeral is held at St Mark's Church, Darling Point. Hundreds turn out spontaneously as police escort the cortege to the cemetery, accompanied by the Scots College Band. Meanwhile, Detective Constable Harry Tupman goes to Adelaide to investigate the origin of the rug in which Graeme was wrapped.
In the beginning, I was detailed to take the rug to South Australia, to the Onkaparinga Mills, and see if I could get it identified. And to take a statement from some person there that, of course, could give us proof that it was a rug from there.
Tupman establishes that the rug is one of 3,000 manufactured at the Onkaparinga Mills in 1955 and 1956. But he also finds a connection between the rug and Stephen Bradley when he visits the Melbourne store that had sold that particular rug. From there, he tracks down the person who bought it.
So I went from Adelaide to Melbourne, and there was a gentleman known to be an associate of Mrs. Bradley, and for that reason I got the assistance of the Melbourne CIB, and we located him. I think he was working as a kitchen hand, and took him back to Russell Street, where I interviewed him at some length, and he admitted that the rug that I showed him was identical with a rug he had given to Mrs. Bradley on the birth of her child.
Descriptions and pictures of the picnic rug and the blue Ford Custom Line are published in newspapers and magazines and shown on TV news bulletins. Now the results of the scientific investigations begin to come in. Plant pathologists have examined mould found on Graeme's shoes and have determined that the mould is several weeks old. This shows that Graeme Thorne was almost certainly killed soon after his kidnapping. The team from the Royal Botanic Gardens identifies fragments from 2 different types of cypress bush found with the body. One is relatively common. The other, however, is rare.
Both of them would be grown to some extent, but having the 2 of them in one place would be very unusual. Having the 2 together, you know, if something occurs in 1 in 1,000 gardens and something else in 1 in 1,000, having the 2 together is a very rare occasion, and so a wonderful clue.
The geologist has found pinkish grains of sand that can only be pink builder's mortar. the same type of mortar found on Graeme's clothing. The police scientific team can now put together a rough description of the house they're looking for. It'll have 2 types of cypress trees growing in the garden, and there'll be pink mortar lying on hard surfaces. The occupant of the house either owns or owned an iridescent blue 1955 Ford Custom Line and will almost certainly have owned a Pekingese dog. Detective Roy Coleman, a meticulous investigator, is sent along with Detective George Shields for a street study of the area. What they discover is quite remarkable and will break open the investigation.
The detectives had specimens of the plants we were looking for and also photographs of what they would be like. And with that information, a postman said that he did know of a place where there was an iridescent blue Ford. These people had moved out though, he said, and he thought that the house was built with pink limestone mortar, a little bit unusual in that area. And he said there were some unusual plants in the garden that looked very much like the samples that you've got. And he referred us to a house in Moore Street, Clontarf, which was not a terribly long distance away from where the body was found.
The man who owned this house and who moved on the day of Graeme Thorne's kidnapping is fast becoming the prime suspect. That man is Stephen Leslie Bradley, the same man who'd been interviewed by Detective Sergeant Doyle and who had admitted that he owned an iridescent blue Ford Custom Line. But now police have a new problem. Bradley has already fled the country. By early October 1960, police have been able to make a very strong connection between Stephen Leslie Bradley and the murder of Graeme Thorne. But Bradley has already sailed out of Sydney with his family aboard the ocean liner Himalaya, bound for London. When the Himalaya berths in Melbourne a few days later, Bradley sends a letter to real estate agent Harry Peachy.
Well, that morning they came in and they asked if I knew a Stephen Bradley, and I said yes, I knew a Stephen Bradley. He was a tenant of mine up till recently when I'd received a letter from him telling me he was going to vacate. And they said, did I still have the letter? And I said yes, and I gave them the letter as far as I can remember. It became evidence as far as I know. There was nothing about him which would suggest that he would do what he did. Well, I mean, he seemed a normal sort of a European, decent sort of a bloke, I mean, as far as I can see.
Graham Morrison remembers Stephen Bradley very differently. He worked alongside Bradley at the Broughton Hall Psychiatric Clinic in the late 50s.
I mean, he was a threatening type of fellow, you know, just in his stature. He was a big fellow, always had a solemn expression on his face, never smiled, you know. Patients wouldn't take the opportunity to speak with him. You know, people have this demure, don't they? Some people you can feel you can be both friends with, others are just, ooh, I don't like this fellow, you know. And it seemed to show through with the, you know, with the patients.
The evidence against Bradley continues to mount. Police from the Scientific Bureau returned to the house in Clontarf that Bradley has recently sold.
I went to that scene, yes, and with other detectives we examined the garage area. I took numerous photographs which would later be used in court, showing the location of the trees, the pink limestone mortar, the interior of the garage. When we examined that, among the foundations of the house at the rear of the garage, there had been a pile of lawn clippings dumped. There was damp clay there. There was pink limestone mortar amongst the bricks and not dressed as neatly as it was on the outside of the building. A single tassel of a rug was found in an area which was virtually a little bit out of sight. It was around behind a part of the foundations that you couldn't see from the entrance door.
Jack Snowden also investigates the flat Bradley rented in Osborne Road, Manly.
At the side of the flat on the outside, amongst a pile of rubbish, a crumpled up length of 35mm black and white negative was found. This was taken to the scientific section, cleaned and flattened as best as we could, and prints were taken from it. The prints showed Bradley and his family sitting on a rug, identical in pattern to the one that was wrapped around the body.
The dog hairs found on the rug have been identified as coming from a Pekingese. After questioning Bradley's neighbours in Clontarf, Detective Sergeant Jack Bateman learns that the suspect does in fact own a Pekingese.
We found out that he had left a Pekingese dog with a veterinary hospital with instructions to send it overseas, and he would send the money for the dog to be transported. The dog was eventually found, examined, specimens of hair taken from it, which also proved to be identical to what we had on the rug.
Detectives have also tracked down a vacuum cleaner that Bradley has recently sold. It contains hairs from the Pekingese dog and human hairs traced to brushes owned by Stephen and Magda Bradley. And then another major breakthrough. They tracked down the blue Ford Custom Line.
They found it in some car yard somewhere, and lo and behold, when they searched the boot of the car, there were hairs and fibres that matched the kids' clothing, and Graeme's clothing and his hair.
Now, absolutely certain that Bradley is their man, police discover that the Himalaya is scheduled to call into Colombo, the capital of the former British colony of Ceylon. Hopeful that they can have him extradited back to Australia, they alert the captain of the ship, who keeps Bradley under close surveillance. 2 days after the ship berths, Bradley is arrested by police and imprisoned. Protesting his innocence, he sends wife Magda and their children on to London as he prepares to fight extradition. But getting Bradley home to face trial will be a legal marathon in itself. Ceylon, soon to be known as Sri Lanka, has recently become an independent nation and has no extradition treaty with Australia. But on October the 18th, after weeks of legal argument, the extradition request is finally granted.
Bateman, who was the doyen of the investigators in those days, on many big cases and probably the most successful homicide detective of his day, he and Detective Sergeant Doyle was dispatched to Colombo to grab Bradley, exercise the extradition warrant and bring him back to Sydney.
Doyle and Bateman do not sleep on the long flight home. They watch their man closely, even though Bradley is handcuffed at all times. Bradley is talkative throughout the flight, and as the plane approaches Sydney, he drops a bombshell.
In the plane circling over Sydney, Bateman said Bradley led across to him and said, "I did it," or "I'd done it." He didn't speak very good English, and made that admission.
But they brought him back, and I know that he confessed to Bateman on the way back on the aeroplane, because Bateman was absolutely fantastic with people. He could talk for hours and hours and win their confidence and make them feel that they'd done something rotten and that they'd feel a great deal better if they confessed. Wouldn't work with these louts around the streets now, but then it did. He was fabulous with it.
A big squad of police waits at Mascot Airport as the Comet bringing Stephen Leslie Bradley back from Colombo lands and taxis along the tarmac. Special precautions are taken to keep Bradley out of sight. Uniformed police form a semicircle round the plane as it stops outside the international terminal. News cameramen are ready as the passengers alight, but there's no sign of Bradley or the two detectives, Sergeant Doyle and Sergeant Bateman, who escorted him from Colombo. They've left the plane by the cruise door and leave the airport by a rear exit gate.
Later that day, Bradley appears in Central Court and is remanded in custody to the Coroner's Court. 2 days later, he's placed in a police lineup.
I was part of the team that went around and assembled a larger number than normal for a lineup, and as I recollect, we got several of them from the Greek club nearby, people of Greek nationality, thinking that would be in fairness to Bradley.
Frida identified Bradley, but she refused to put a hand on him. And Basil also identified him, but refused to put a hand on him, as requested by Sergeant Kay, who was the officer conducting the lineup.
Cecil Denmead, the young man who'd identified the blue Ford Custom Line near the Thorne home on the morning of the kidnapping, then steps forward and identifies Bradley as the driver of the vehicle.
I went through all that procedure and I had to go up and touch the guy on the shoulder as an identification. Whether they do that now or not, I don't know, but that was what I had to do. When I touched him, he didn't flinch. Yeah, didn't even move.
The inquest begins on November the 22nd, 1960, 4.5 months after Graeme's disappearance. The evidence from police, scientific experts and numerous other witnesses is conclusive. Stephen Leslie Bradley is ordered to stand trial for the murder of 8-year-old schoolboy Graeme Thorne.
A Qantas Boeing 707 arrives in Sydney, bringing Mrs. Magda Bradley and her 3 children back to Australia. The state government paid the fares to enable Mrs. Bradley to appear as a defence witness at her husband's trial. 6 uniformed police are present to clear a path for the Bradleys as they make their way to the state government car, which drove them off to their city hotel. Later, she spent 2 hours with her husband's counsel, the public defender, Mr. Vizard. Mrs. Bradley saw her husband in Long Bay Jail for the first time since his arrest in Colombo. Detective Sergeants Bateman and Doyle will be 2 principal Crown witnesses as Stephen Leslie Bradley goes on trial for murder.
Australia's trial of the century begins on the 21st of March, 1961, with Justice Clancy presiding. Crowds flock to the court. The upper gallery is men only, so women begin pushing and fighting for seats in the only other public gallery at the back of the court. There are uncontrolled demonstrations outside in the streets. Stephen Bradley, represented by public defender Frederick Vizard, springs a major surprise. He pleads not guilty.
With Bradley's plea of not guilty, we didn't lose hope. We were quite satisfied that the evidence that we had and the support that we had from the Crown prosecutor was ample to prove his guilt. He was defended by the public defender, who was a well-known legal identity, and I have no doubt that Bradley had a very fair trial.
Bradley seems calm and unflustered as he listens to the compelling evidence against him.
He just sat there most of the time showing very little emotion at all. I saw him on a daily basis and, you know, he's in the dock every day, and there was nothing about the man that you'd think was remarkable, that I remember that stood out as any sort of either facially or physically. He was just a nondescript, pudgy, you know, bloke you'd see in the street and not look at twice.
The Crown Prosecutor, Mr. W.J. Knight QC, outlines the case, and it's overwhelming. Witness identification, the blue Ford Custom Line, and samples of soil, vegetation, and dog hairs have been linked conclusively to Bradley. Accidental death is ruled out by tests proving Graeme's death could only have been the result of a violent blow to the head. A total of 70 witnesses, including 7 police, give evidence. Based on the mountain of evidence that's been collected, Crown Prosecutor Knight paints a detailed picture of how the crime unfolded. Bradley learned of Basil Thorne's Opera House lottery win from the newspapers and concocted a plot to kidnap Graeme and demand a ransom. He watched Graeme's movements for several days before deciding to strike on the morning of July the 7th. Bradley parked his car, then intercepted Graeme, telling him that Mrs. Smith was sick and unable to take him to school as usual. It's believed he then drove Graeme to nearby Centennial Park. It's almost certain that this is where he murdered the boy and threw his body into the boot of his car. Bradley made his ransom demand from a public phone near the Spit Bridge, not far from his Clontarf home. He then took the body home, wrapped it in the Onka Paringa brand rug, and dumped it in the vacant lot in Seaforth. Later, he tossed Graeme's school bag into bush near the Wakehurst Parkway in Sydney's north. He then sold his blue custom line and other personal effects, including his vacuum cleaner, before making arrangements to escape the country on board the Himalaya. Frederick Vizard's defence of Bradley is as professional and vigorous as possible. He calls Bradley's wife Magda as a witness. She'd returned with their children to support Bradley. But after an 8-day trial, the verdict comes quickly. Bradley is found guilty of the kidnapping and murder of Graeme Thorne. The court erupts.
People in the court, inside and out, cheered. They were so excited that this criminal had been found guilty of this heinous crime.
Well, I've never experienced anything like it. It was more like a grand final, the noise outside the courthouse from the public. It was quite an uproar for a moment.
I had never seen anything like it before. The public were jubilant. They clapped, they cheered. The judge tolerated it. Normal circumstances, such a thing wouldn't be tolerated in a court, even at the end of a trial. But the judge was conscious of the public feeling, and he did permit it.
For Basil and Frida Thorne, justice has been done, but nothing can bring their son back.
So they were glad it was all over, and it was a great relief to find out that he'd been convicted.
His death from a heart attack in 1968, aged 43, was greeted by police and the public with little sympathy. Many of the investigators remain convinced Bradley did not act alone in planning and carrying out this callous crime. They believe they know who else was involved, but they've got no proof. As a direct result of this case, the law is changed so that lottery winners can protect themselves and opt not to have their names published. Tragic though it was, the story of Graeme Thorne's kidnapping and murder is a story of police dedication and the pioneering of forensic investigations in Australia. It's also a story of greed and inhumanity that caused an entire nation to grieve and tore apart a normal Australian family.
Oh, it's remarkable. For its day and age, it once again, it led the way. We didn't have back then the scientific expertise we've got now. But in its day, it was probably the leading edge in scientific forensic science, yeah.
Cooperation was really on 110%. And that's, it's the best investigation I was ever involved with, there's no question about that, by far.
What happened here on Queensland's Sunshine Coast almost 2 years ago to 13-year-old schoolboy Daniel Morecambe is reminiscent of Graeme Thorne, both boys grabbed from busy streets. But unlike the kidnapping at Bondi so long ago, Daniel Morecambe is still missing, probably dead. His disappearance still the subject of intense media and public attention. The story you're about to see embraces a grieving family struggling to deal with the loss of a son. But as you'll also see, this is a story of unbelievable resolve and extraordinary spirit. This then is Daniel's story. The village of Palmwoods sits in a valley in the hinterland on Queensland's Sunshine Coast, a world away from big city crime. It's here in this idyllic part of Queensland that Bruce and Denise Morecambe have decided to settle. It's the perfect setting to bring up a family. It's a postcard paradise. But what happened here almost 2 years ago changes the Morecambe family's life forever, produces enormous public anger and support, and one of the biggest criminal investigations in Queensland's history, one that continues to this very day.
We got up fairly early that day. It was a Sunday. The boys, often on the weekends, picked passion fruit on a neighbouring property, and it was also a day, being the 7th of December, that we had organised for a Christmas work do, which was in Brisbane. But as it turned out, on that morning, there were just some misty showers passing by, so it was decided that they just postponed the picking for an hour and start at 7:30. Thus, they had the perfect excuse, I suppose, to put it like that they didn't have to come to Brisbane to attend the Christmas function with us.
It's the afternoon of Sunday, the 7th of December 2003. 13-year-old Daniel Morecambe, a twin and one of 3 Morecambe boys, heads for the nearby town of Maroochydore to buy Christmas presents for his family. His parents, Bruce and Denise, are away for the day, so Daniel plans to buy his presents and hide them before Mum and Dad come home.
We weren't aware that the boys had split up on the day.
He's taken the hour-long trip many times before, a 30-minute walk up the street until he hits the main road. And from there, he'll hail a bus for the 20-minute trip to Maroochydore. Senior Sergeant Julie Elliott is a member of the Queensland Police Media Unit. She's been closely involved with the investigation from the start.
On that Sunday, December 7, Daniel had decided to go shopping to the Maroochydore shopping plaza. He'd asked his brothers whether they would like to go. There was Christmas shopping to be done and he wanted a haircut. And the other boys decided they didn't want to go. So Daniel left the house about 1 o'clock in the afternoon to walk down to the Nambour Connection Road to catch a bus, the 1:30 bus. And when that bus didn't come, unbeknownst to anyone, that bus had actually broken down. So a second bus was sent. It went past at about 10 minutes past 2, but even though Daniel hailed it, it didn't stop. What people saw from that bus was a man standing behind Daniel and a blue car and another man standing near that blue car. When the third bus went by a few minutes later, which was to stop at that bus stop, Daniel wasn't there, nor was the car or the 2 men.
Well, when I went to pick Daniel up at about 4:30, I actually drove past Woombai and saw the next bus stop, and I saw a broken down bus about to be put on a tow truck. So when I came back home, I said to Bruce, oh, the timetables might be out because there's a broken down bus. So when Bruce went to pick up Daniel at 5:30 and he wasn't there, we thought that maybe the bus was going to be late. So I jumped on the internet to check out the timetables, and we realised that 5 o'clock was the last bus.
Police hope someone may have seen Daniel at the Keel Mountain Road overpass, 2 kilometres north of the landmark Big Pineapple. He's wearing a red T-shirt with the word Billabong printed on the front, dark knee-length shorts, white socks and light-coloured shoes. It's a busy road and hundreds of cars stream past as Daniel patiently waits by the roadside for the next bus. It's here at the Kiel Mountain Road overpass that Daniel is last seen just after 2 o'clock on that Sunday afternoon. But something is not quite right with the unfolding scene. Daniel is standing on the highway. He's talking to a man on a grassy ridge. A second man is in what witnesses report is a 1980s model, 4-door, dark blue sedan. And there's a white, unoccupied courier-type van that's parked just over there. When Mr. and Mrs. Morecambe return late that afternoon, there's no sign of Daniel. As darkness begins to fall, they become even more concerned.
So we drove down to Maroochydore, the Sunshine Plaza, jumped out, asked one of the bus drivers to help me check the timetable. I was sort of panicking a bit because Daniel wasn't at the bus stop there. He told me the last bus was 5:05, so we came back home to see if Daniel was here. He wasn't here, so we really started to panic.
Daniel Morecambe has vanished, and despite a desperate search of the surrounding area by his parents, there are simply no clues as to his whereabouts. It's now 24 hours since Daniel disappeared. Bruce and Denise Morecambe have spent a sleepless night worrying about their son. In the morning, Sergeant Elliott organises a press conference appealing for public assistance.
People then did start to ring in to tell police that they had observed a blue car, 2 men, and Daniel waiting for the bus.
And we are desperate for any information about him.
In fact, there has never been as many calls to police about any other case in the history of Queensland Police Service as Daniel's. And we've had something in excess of 14,000 pieces of information come in, which is quite unbelievable. And every one of those pieces of information have to be logged and looked at.
Police hope for the best, but fear the worst. The search for Daniel Morecambe intensifies. The circumstances surrounding his disappearance are extremely unusual, and police and volunteers quickly launch a massive search in a desperate attempt to find the missing boy. Hundreds of homes are canvassed in the area where Daniel was last seen, and a description is circulated throughout the state.
It was a heartbreaking appeal made at the site where the teenager was last seen.
We both want Daniel home. It's been 7 days since he was last seen. It's a matter of urgency. Somebody must have seen him somewhere.
Daniel Morecambe's parents held today's news conference on the busy highway in the hope that someone might remember seeing their son there.
We want Daniel back.
Despite the media blitz and an exhaustive search, there is no sign of the teenager. Detective Inspector John Maloney is in charge of the investigation.
Well, we definitely have witnesses saw him walking down towards the bus stop, and we are certain that he was by the side of the road under the bridge, waiting for the bus. After that, there's a lot of speculation based on various witnesses' accounts of what happened. We don't know whether there's 1 or 2 persons involved. We believe the blue car is definitely involved, and in all likelihood there probably were 2 people. But there's a lot of gaps in our intelligence at this stage. I'm sure that he has been murdered, and it was probably soon after the event, but it's just purely speculation on when and where and how.
Queenslanders rally to support the Morecambes. The Daniel Morecambe Foundation is established and inundated with donations from the public. The foundation is set up initially to help maintain the hunt for Daniel and his abductors.
Please call Crime Stoppers. No one will ever know you did.
The huge amount of money pledged to the foundation also pays for television and radio appeals, along with posters and pamphlets, which are circulated throughout Queensland.
It's really been what makes us get up in the morning and push through, I suppose, in the tougher times, in that people we've never met, sometimes it's just somebody, as we purchase the newspapers, or someone passing by, or a generous offer via the police media unit have offered assistance with printing of this or writing a song. doing a picture or painting or donating, you know, something to be raffled. It's absolutely astounding what people have done and incredible offers.
And there's still, to this day, we're getting Crime Stoppers calls coming in, which is exactly what we want, because someone out there does know what's happened.
Daniel's older brother, Dean, and his twin, Brad, are still coming to terms with the tragedy of Daniel's abduction.
You just can't really imagine it ever happening. It just happened one day, and you just got to put up with it. You can't really do anything about it. Once I dreamt that, because from here to under the bridge where he went, it's like a steep part off the road. I dreamt once that he might have fallen down there, but obviously the SES have looked and things, so yeah.
So he was your twin brother.
Yeah.
What do you miss most about him?
Just him being around. We're good friends. Always helped me with my schoolwork and everything.
Do you go into his room?
Now?
Yeah.
Not usually, no.
Yeah. What's it like at school? I mean, you had a lot of friends at school.
Yeah. It's different, catching the bus by myself and everything, and coming home by myself. But everyone's pretty nice at school.
Good mates?
Yeah.
Very supportive?
Yes.
And what about Mum and Dad? They must go through tough times too.
Yes, they get sad sometimes, like everything that reminds them of him.
You help them? Try to G them up?
Yeah.
Get them out of it? Because I'm sure there are days when Mum's up and Dad's down and Dad's down and Mum's up.
Yeah, gets a bit like that.
Sergeant Julie Elliott has become very close to the Morecambes and is present at a family gathering for Daniel and Bradley's 14th birthday, just 11 days after the abduction.
It was the most unbelievable experience because you're trying to cater to both. It was impossible, it really was. It was very significant in the symbol of the 3 baptism candles of the boys, Daniel, Bradley and Dean. There were three of us police there, and Father Jan and Father Joe, and the candles were lit, but one blew out, one extinguished. It was so symbolic, it was really a very, very emotional experience. And that was the day that Monique said, you know, my Daniel's dead.
The Morecambes are now living a nightmare. Everywhere they turn, they see Daniel. Photos of him are scattered throughout the house. Daniel's bedroom is littered with memories. Spread across his bed is a specially made quilt, presented to the Morecambes as a moving tribute to their son's memory. Standing alone in an adjoining paddock, Daniel's black Shetland pony waits patiently for him to come walking down the driveway. Daniel's plight galvanises the local community, and as the news breaks, the Morecambe family's pain is felt not just by Queenslanders, but by people across Australia. Someone must have seen something. Someone knows something. Someone holds the key. A national appeal is launched, and the public responds.
Doesn't matter if it's daytime, nighttime, on a busy road, in a shopping centre. It can happen at any time to anyone. I mean, Bruce and I didn't ask for this to happen, but it can happen anywhere. And that's why we're launching the foundation, to appeal to people to, you know, educate their children on child safety and abduction, and it can just happen to anyone.
A vehicle of interest and a person of interest that's been seen.
Police, sifting through literally thousands of pieces of information supplied by the public, release a sketch of a man seen talking to Daniel on the day he vanished. They also appeal for information about the blue sedan and the white van, also seen near the overpass. Days turn into weeks, weeks turn into months. But despite releasing descriptions of the men, the car and the van, police are still no closer to finding Daniel Morecambe.
We've made inquiries in every state and territory in Australia, and we've had investigators travel to most states. We've made inquiries overseas.
The red ribbons and bouquets that adorn the overpass where Daniel disappeared are now somewhat faded by the sun, but they convey the enduring and total public support for the Morecambe family.
I think the biggest feeling that we all get is the sense of not knowing anything and how quickly it all happened, and it's coming up 2 years in December, and we've grown up heaps since then, but we still don't have that understanding.
The Daniel Morecambe Foundation is a work in progress, a testament to him, his family and friends who just want to know where is Daniel and who took him. They and the police still want any information that will answer those questions, and they will never give up. Tim Ryan is a local businessman and family friend.
Give yourselves up, because we'll find you. Give yourselves up. Have some bloody conscience. Just don't do it to anyone. You're not just doing it to a family, you're doing it to a whole community. You know, just give up, because we'll find you. We cannot tolerate it. It can't become part of our life.
Everywhere you go in Queensland, you can see Daniel's face. It's on posters, bumper stickers, pizza boxes and milk cartons. Many companies have given generously of their time, money and resources. But they're not the only ones who've rallied around the Morecambes. Among the many individuals who've lent their support is Dave the trucker. Dave has turned his prime mover into a travelling billboard. His regular route takes him from the Sunshine Coast to Toowoomba and Lismore, travelling around 3,000 kilometres every week.
What price and what acts do you put on the life of a child? You know, people will be sitting there at home tonight. When you're sitting there, have a look at your 15-year-old or your 13-year-old and think what they're doing today. That's what Daniel is missing out on. His parents and brothers are missing out on. So, you know, it's a small token. It's a small effort as far as I'm concerned.
The Morecambes are overwhelmed by the remarkable generosity and kindness offered to them. Mostly it comes from complete strangers.
The coast is crying, this country's uniting in the search for a little boy. Red ribbons for bleeding hearts on houses, buses, schools and cars.
Tom Palmer is another of Daniel's school friends, and like everyone who knew him, he thinks about Daniel every day.
Yeah, I think about Daniel pretty much every time, every day, every time I see anything red, I just think of Daniel, how much I miss him.
December marks the second anniversary of Daniel's disappearance. With the realisation that he won't be coming home, all that remains for Daniel's family and friends is a determination to solve the case and come to terms with their emotions.
My anger hasn't come out. It's really strange. I think it sort of sits inside, but I know the day they do find these people, they won't be able to stop me. I don't think they'd let me near them, that's for sure.
I suppose when we think back to the very early days, where I basically wrote a sign, it's a message from the heart that says, "Swing, you bastard, justice will be done." And really that's the controlled anger, I suppose, that I have.
For the Morecambes, there can only be one outcome that will ease their pain. They simply want closure.
What we've got to understand is there's a child killer out there. We cannot let this person do it again. So if they're associated in any way, it may be a family member, a jilted lover, maybe just serve this guy a hamburger. Come forward with the information and put this prick away.
Someone's got some information and, you know, they must have a conscience. And can they please just come forward and, you know, give our family some peace and don't let this crime happen again.
There is nothing more certain than someone out there knows. And the people that are involved in this investigation will work until we get that bit of information. If someone out there thinks we're just going away, they're sadly mistaken. Sadly mistaken. There's a dedicated team of detectives working on this still 7 days a week. We know someone knows. Daniel did not disappear into thin air. Daniel was abducted and we believe murdered. Daniel, what we believe, is dead. His pain's over. You've got a family living this every waking moment of their life, an extended family. And from a police perspective, we need to and have to get these people that are responsible so that it doesn't happen again. Yes, someone knows.
Someone out there knows something. The smallest piece of information can lead to solving the mystery of Daniel's disappearance. There's currently a $250,000 reward for information leading to the conviction of the person or persons responsible for Daniel's abduction. There is also the offer of indemnity to anyone not directly involved. If you have any information, you can call Crime Stoppers right now on 1800 333 000.
They can ring in and hang up after having given a name, an address, a car registration. And I'd like them to think about spending half an hour with Denise Morcombe and then keeping that information to themselves. Just to look into her eyes and feel the pain, and you do when you're with her. You know, no parent should have to experience this, no one. And they have, whoever has done this and whoever else knows about it, because people talk, then try and have some heart and some conscience about it. Tell someone, and then we can give that information to Denise, because all she wants to do is say goodbye to her son. She wants to do that and give him the dignity that he deserves out of an absolute tragedy.
Every mother, every child, every father, every son, anyone with a friend, red ribbons flying for the bleeding hearts on our buses, schools and cars and homes. There are enough angels on the ground. There are enough angels flying around. Someone's seen Daniel. Someone's seen Daniel. Someone's seen Daniel. It's not too late. If someone's seen Daniel. If someone's seen Daniel. If someone's seen Daniel. Help him find his way.